Namaskar. We are going to start a lecture series on disaster management. Today, we are going to talk about the concept and principles of disaster management. So, today's lecture, we are going to discuss about what is disaster, what are the different terminologies which we are using for disaster management, what is the disaster management cycle, and what are the different parameters which we are considering for disaster management planning and disaster management cycle. Now, let us start with that. What is disaster and from where it has arrived to? Disaster is basically from the French word désastre, maybe Italian disastro, and the Greek prefix that is disaster means bad star. Is the impact of a natural or man-made hazard that negatively affect the society or the environment. The word disaster root is from the astrology. This implies that when the star is in the bad position, a bad event will occur, and that is what disaster. A disaster can be further defined as an event, maybe natural or man-made, sudden or progressive, which impacts the community in such severity that the affected community has to respond by taking exceptional measures. Disaster is not new event. For time immemorial, we are facing the disaster, but the disaster has started aggravating in very recent past. Hazards are always existing. Only our unsustained development is leading towards a disaster. So there is a requirement that how better we can do the disaster management. Rapid growth, poor development, or ignorant about the hazards are mainly leading towards the disaster. What are the basic key mantras for disaster management? We need to develop a culture, and culture of what? Culture of basic preparedness, culture of strategic thinking, culture of quick response, and culture of prevention and mitigation. Once these particular 4 parameters and 4 key issues are taken into account, we hope and we find that our disaster is better managed. We are finding that whenever the disaster is happening in developed countries, happening in developing countries and underdeveloped countries, the situations are very, very different. In developed countries, nobody is dying. In developing countries, few people or maybe in hundreds. But if you go to the underdeveloped countries, we are finding that the thousands and thousands of people are dying because of the disaster. And it is all happening because the culture of preparedness, culture of safety, culture of prevention and mitigation, and culture of strategy thinking, it is absolutely missing in that particular situation. So, let us discuss about the terminologies. What terminologies are usually be used in disaster management? Basically, I am going to discuss about the 3 major parameters or the terms which we are using, that is the hazard, vulnerability, and risk. How we can define the hazard? Hazard, it's a natural event that has a potential to cause harm or losses, or otherwise also we can define the hazard in such a way that a rare or extreme natural or man-made events that has the potential to cause harm or losses. A hazard is a threat, a future source of danger. Hazard can be contained, then there will not be any disaster. And who is going to be affected by the hazard? It might be the community, the people, in terms of deaths, injury, disease, or the stress. It might be human activity like economics, education, etc. The property, like all infrastructures what we talk about, they may be affected by the hazard. Property and your all infrastructures like the bridges, the houses, your all economic centers, the commercial centers, and environment. The loss of flora, fauna, pollution, loss of amenities, these are the basic components of our society which is going to be affected by the hazard. We can define further the hazard assessment. The hazard assessment can be defined as it is the process of estimating for defined areas the probabilities of the occurrence of potentially damaging phenomena of given magnitude within a specific period of time. So once we start assessing the hazard, that the process is called hazard assessment. The second term is vulnerability. Vulnerability we can define as a set of prevailing or consequent conditions which adversely affect the community's ability to prevent, mitigate and prepare for or respond to the hazard event. What are the basic reasons for vulnerability? How the segment or the component of our society it is going to be vulnerable? It depends upon the poverty. If the people living below the poverty line, they may be more suffering from the disaster impacts. It might be the rapid urbanization. Because of the urbanization and that also the rapid urbanization, especially we are finding that in developing countries or underdeveloped countries where the all infrastructure resources are mostly concentrated in the urban areas, because of that the people try to go to the urban areas, and because of that there is a rapid growth, and once the demand is very high and accordingly the resources are limited, then we are finding that the process of development will not be sustained. And because of that we are finding just what we have seen during the various earthquakes or even that the cyclone impacts, that the built infrastructure was not sustained. Because of that there was huge loss of infrastructure and properties in the urban areas. Also we are finding the slums are rapidly increasing in the urban areas, and whatever the settlements are there, whatever the facilities are provided to the slum dwellers, it is absolutely pathetic, and adequate support and the facilities are not there. Because of that the impacts or disasters are aggravated in the slum areas. Increase in the population density. What we are finding that in developed countries like America or Japan, where the population density is comparatively lesser than the developing countries like India, Bangladesh or the country like China, where in a single disaster the death tolls are ranging from thousands to the lakhs. So the increase in the population density, it is also one of the very important parameter which is really linking it to the vulnerability of our society. Change in the lifestyle. The change in the lifestyle also sometimes aggravates the vulnerable condition. Environmental degradation. Whatever the hydrological and meteorological disasters what we are finding at this moment, it is all happening because of the environmental degradation. All low-lying areas which is regularly visited by floods, it is not taken into account, and because of that we are finding that mostly it is the floods are aggravated. In recent past we are finding the central part of India, they are basically suffering from lot of acute floods and flood sort of situation. So that is also because of the environmental degradation, that is also one of the issue and the factor which influences the vulnerability. Lack of awareness. This is the key issue where everybody should know about what is disaster and in different type of disaster what we require to do. Unless until the people are not aware of what is required to be done at the time of a specific type of disasters, the people will be suffering and the losses will be more and more. So these are the few parameters which we discussed about how these factors are influencing our vulnerability. We find different type of vulnerability. It may be the physical vulnerability, it may be economic vulnerability, or it might be your social vulnerability. So in physical vulnerability, whatever the infrastructure you develop, either in terms of your built environment, maybe we can say housing, house stock, or it might be your commercial buildings, might be your water or sewage line, might be the bridges. These all are basically the physical entities in our society, and if we are not taking into account of the disasters, they are going to be affected. So these are coming under the physical vulnerability. Economic vulnerability might be the cities like Bombay or Delhi, which is the commercial capitals, and lot of economic activities are taking place. If disaster takes place, then we are finding that there is a huge loss of economy in those areas. Social vulnerability, if disaster occurs, our all threads of the society, it is disturbed, and because of that we are finding that our whole social system, it is going to change, or it is going to be disturbed. So these are the three type of vulnerability that we have discussed. Now coming to the point of your risk. What do you mean by risk? We always use this particular terminology as a risk, and risk is basically a combination of hazard and vulnerability. So risk can be defined as the function of hazard and vulnerability. That it can be further defined as the chance of something happening that will be having an impact on the objective, and it is always measured in terms of consequences or the likelihood. Let us discuss about the type of impacts of disaster. It might be personal, it might be social, physical, environmental, ecological, cultural. So it may affect our society in very, very different fashion and different ways. And we have seen many times, we go through the media and we are finding that how an individual is going to be affected by disaster. Maybe he will be losing his family members, he may be having some problems, he might lose his houses or the business. So that particularly impacts individual. Social, how we have a certain pattern of living and settlement, and because of the disaster it might be possible that we are going to be affected. Our social system, it is going to be fragmented. Physical, as I told you, how basically the physical infrastructure is going to be affected. Maybe you can take example of earthquake. Because of the earthquake, it might be possible that all the linkages which is accessing to the city or any area, it is going to be hampered, inaccessibility will be there, and because of that you will be finding that the economic growth of that area, even that the relief supply to those areas, it is going to be badly affected. Environmental, maybe because of the landslides, we can say due to the floods also, there is a ecological or environmental losses, so that is also impacting negatively to our society. And cultural threats are always there because of the disasters. Now let us try to understand what are the level of impacts. We define usually the impacts like the primary impact, secondary impact and tertiary impact. How we define the primary impact? Suppose there is a city, an earthquake has taken place, and because of the earthquake there might be certain dams or reservoirs. Because of the earthquake there is a fracture or the crack in the retaining wall or the dams itself, and because of that there is a leakage of water, there is a complete water is gushing out in the downstream, and complete the downstream area is flooded. So the damage in the bridge, reservoir or the water structure, that is the second impact. Because of that there is a flooding in the low-lying areas or downstream area, so that is the secondary impact. And because of the flooding, if there is a epidemics, so we define it as the disaster impacted in the tertiary level. So this is the basic thing, and once we are started, we are planning for disaster management, we have to understand and analyze the primary impact, secondary impact and tertiary impact of the disasters. For time being, just let us understand, if the floods are there, what are the secondary impacts of floods? It might be your epidemics. Sometimes we are having the snake bite also because of the floods. Drought. Due to the drought, there might be epidemics, famine, earthquake, we can see landslides, there might be fire because in the urban areas we are finding fire, floods, civil war, we are finding the refugees and people are displaced, and landslides, there might be epidemics and floods. So these you can see few examples I have quoted, that initially the disaster is there, but the impacts are different at different level. Now let us understand the disaster management cycle, because if we talk about disaster management, there is a complete cycle. It starts from pre-disaster phase, during disaster, and post-disaster. Pre-disaster phase, what are the basic parameters, what are the basic terms which we are using for disaster management planning? It is basically prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. Once we talk about during disaster, it is basically a response time, and response activities are included in that particular phase. And after that, there is a post-disaster phase where reconstruction, redevelopment, rehabilitation, these are the different parameters or the terms which we are using. And especially once the disaster has taken place, we are basically improvising, we are just trying to make the system, our society, normal to the normalcy. So that is basically your post-disaster phase. Now let us discuss one by one how we define the prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. Prevention, it is to provide permanent protection from the disaster or reduce intensity, frequency of disaster so that it doesn't become a disaster. It means that once we are talking about the man-made disasters like chemical spillage, might be your industrial disasters, hazards are there, might be accidents where there is an absolute chance that we can prevent the happening of and converting into the disaster. Now, how we define preparedness? Preparedness covers activities to enhance the ability to predict, respond to, and cope with the effects of disaster. It includes action to assume that an event will be disastrous and prepare people to react appropriately during and following the event. In fact, in preparedness time, we know that the disaster is existing, hazards are there, and it may trigger any time. And how to control that? We need to create people, we need to make people ready to face it, and what is required to be done, the people should know about it and how they are going to respond to it. So this is preparedness. Now, mitigation. Mitigation measures taken in advance of a disaster aiming at reducing its adverse impact on the community, society, and environment. How in general we can define mitigation? Suppose if we are in zone 3 of earthquake, seismic zone 3, then we need to know that how disaster is going to impact the society. It is basically buildings which will collapse, the infrastructure which will collapse, and because of that the people will be affected. So our prime motto will be to strengthen those buildings, provide all sort of support to that building, so that, or infrastructure, so that when the disaster is there, the buildings are shaking but it is not collapsing. So the mechanism and the process which we will follow, it will come under the mitigation. Now, response, as I told you, it covers measures required for search and rescue of survivors and for meeting the basic survival needs of shelter, water, food, and healthcare, etc. So, once the disaster is there, we may require certain help for the health, food, water, nutrition, care for children, care for vulnerable section of our society. So, in fact, you require a very, very different approach for different type of disasters. Like in case of earthquake, if we are talking about the health support or health facilities, then maybe in case of earthquake, lot of fractures will be there, there will be suffocation, the treatment of the victims will be different, but once we are talking about the floods, the treatment of the victims will be absolutely different. In case of drought, the requirement of response will be absolutely different from the floods or the earthquake. So it is very important that we should create community for disaster response. Now let us talk about the recovery. How we define recovery? Recovery covers the interventions in rehabilitation and reconstruction. It is the process undertaken by the disaster affected community to restore itself to pre-disaster level. Once the disaster has taken place and we know that this much number of people have been affected badly by disaster, how we can rehabilitate, how we can provide all the facility to the affected people so that they can lead a normal life. So the process of that particular providing all activities, support, logistics, that comes under the recovery process. Let us try to understand what we have discussed today in this particular lecture. We discussed about what is disaster, how we can define the different terminologies of disaster management. We discussed about hazard, vulnerability, risk, and we discussed briefly about the disaster management cycle, where we discussed about pre-disaster, what are the activities to be taken, during disaster, what are actions required to be taken, and once the disaster is over and we are trying to make the people normalized. So in case of rehabilitation, reconstruction and redevelopment, what activities are required to be taken. So this is the basic area subject we have covered in this particular lecture. Thank you very much.